40 cents. That was what a cotton picker in the Imperial Valley earned for 100 pounds of cotton in 1932. 3 years earlier, the same 100 pounds paid $1.50. By 1933, 1 in 4 Mexican-American workers across California and Texas had no work at all, and the federal government had already shipped 400,000 of their families back across the border. The grandmothers who stayed cooked through it. Number 14 used a quarter pound of lard to feed 8 people. Number 6 stretched 20 cents of beef across 3 days. Number 1 was just a tortilla and a pinch of salt, and it kept children alive. These 25 dishes were not restaurant food. They were depression food. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Here are the 25 lost Mexican foods our grandparents ate to survive. Number 25, frijoles de la olla. Pinto beans in a clay pot, water, salt, half an onion, a clove of garlic if there was one. That was the whole pantry for a Mexican family in San Antonio in 1932. The pot sat on the stove from sunrise to sundown. Every kitchen in the colonia had one going, and you could smell it 3 houses down. Your abuela would simmer the beans for 4 hours, never lifting the lid for the first hour because that was the rule her own mother gave her in Zacatecas. The broth came out thick and brown. You ladled it into a bowl, tore a piece of tortilla, and dipped. 1 pot of beans cost about 8 cents to make in 1933 and fed a family of 6 for 2 days. The clay pot itself, a barro pot bought at the Mercado on Laredo Street, lasted 40 years. Doña Maria de la Cruz on South Flores still had her mother's pot when she died in 1979. The beans she made on her last day were the same beans her mother had made the year the family crossed the border. Nothing in the recipe had changed. Number 24, sopa de fideo with bean broth. When the meat ran out, and it ran out for most Mexican-American households by 1931, Abuela reached for the toasted vermicelli and the leftover bean broth from the night before. She browned the fideo in a little manteca until it turned the color of honey. Then she poured in the bean broth, a crushed tomato, a sliver of onion, a sprig of cilantro from the windowsill pot. 20 minutes later, the noodles had drunk the broth and turned soft. You ate it with the last of the warm tortillas. The bean broth was free. The fideo was 5 cents a package at the corner store on Cala Houston. Mothers fed 5 or 6 children on a single pot, and nobody knew they were eating poor. The fideo brand most families bought in 1933 was La Moderna, milled in Saltillo and shipped north by railcar. 3 nests per package, each fed 2 children. The whole supper came out to a nickel. Number 23, tortillas de manteca. Flour tortillas made the old way. A pound of flour, a tablespoon of lard, salt, and warm water. That was the recipe Doña Lupe in El Paso used for 40 years and never wrote down. She rolled them on a wooden board worn smooth from her mother's hands. Now the comal sat on the back burner all day, and the tortillas came off puffed and freckled. You ate them with anything. You ate them with nothing. During the Depression, a woman could buy a 5-pound bag of Pioneer flour for 19 cents at the Piggly Wiggly on Mesa Street, and that bag stretched into 120 tortillas. That was breakfast, lunch, and supper for a family of 7, and the kitchen smelled like home from sunrise on. The lard came from rendering fat the butcher gave away free on Saturdays. A pound of fat made about a cup of manteca, enough for 2 weeks of tortillas. Doña Lupe judged the dough by how it pulled away from her palm. Number 22, caldo de papa. Potato broth. The cheapest soup any Mexican kitchen ever made. 3 potatoes, a handful of cilantro, half an onion, water, salt. You boiled it until the potatoes broke down on their own and thickened the broth without flour or cream. Then, your abuela cracked an egg into the simmering pot at the very end. The egg poached in the broth, the white going feathery, the yolk staying soft. She served it over a torn tortilla in the bottom of the bowl. Here's the thing about caldo de papa. It was hot, it was filling, and it cost about 4 cents to make in 1933. Working men in the rail yards of Tucson carried it in tin lunch pails. Their wives made it on Mondays when the week's money had to last 6 more days. The trick most people miss in this soup is the order of the salt. Abuela salted the water first, then the potatoes, then the egg. Salting all at the end made the broth taste flat. Salting in 3 stages built the flavor in layers, the way her mother had built it in Sonora. Number 21. Huevos con papas. Potatoes and eggs scrambled together in a black skillet. Doña Carmen on Calle Houston in San Antonio fed her 5 children this every weekday morning from 1929 until 1939. She diced the potatoes the night before, fried them in a spoonful of bacon grease until the edges crisped, then beat in 2 eggs for the whole pan and stretched them across all 5 plates. You wrapped it in a warm flour tortilla and ate it walking to school. Now, eggs cost about 30 cents a dozen back then. Potatoes were a penny a pound. The whole breakfast for 5 kids came out to less than a nickel, and they walked into school with full stomachs while wealthier children went hungry at desks. Doña Carmen's youngest, a boy named Ernesto, born in 1928, told his own grandchildren in the 1990s that he could still smell the bacon grease in the skillet on Monday mornings of 1933 when the rent was due Tuesday. Number 20. Verdolagas con cebolla. Purslane and onion. The wild green that grew in every alley and empty lot from East LA to Brownsville. Mexican grandmothers walked the railroad tracks and the irrigation ditches at sunrise with a paper sack and pulled it up by the handful. Free food. They sautéed it with diced onion and a little manteca, sometimes a few tomatoes when the garden gave them up. Your abuela served it with beans and a stack of tortillas. Her grandmother in Sonora had taught her that a family who ate verdolagas in summer never got sick in winter. Foraged greens kept whole barrios fed when the grocery money ran out in 1934. A woman could pull 2 pounds of verdolagas in 20 minutes along the Santa Fe Railroad line behind the houses on the south side of San Antonio. 2 pounds fed a family of 6. The plant grew back in 3 weeks, year after year. Number 19. Quelites, guisados. Lamb quarters, amaranth leaves, mustard greens, anything green that grew wild in the dirt behind the house. Abuela cooked them with garlic, a chopped tomato, and a pinch of salt. Sometimes a beaten egg stirred in at the end if there was one to spare. The Aztec word quilitl meant edible green, and her great-grandmother had picked these same greens in the same way for 100 years before the Depression hit in 1929. You wrapped the cooked quelites in a warm tortilla and called it a taco. Working families in West Texas survived entire weeks on quelites and beans. The thing is, the children grew up healthy. They had no idea their food was free. They thought everyone ate this way. A study published in the 1970s found that quelites had more iron than spinach and more calcium than milk. The grandmothers in 1933 had no data. They just had a tradition that kept the children alive on land that fed nothing else. Number 18. Chicharrones de harina. Wheat flour wheels fried in lard until they puffed up like clouds. Street vendors in Los Angeles and San Antonio sold them outside schools for a penny apiece in 1934, drizzled with red chili and a squeeze of lime. At home, your abuela kept a pound of the dry pasta wheels in a glass jar above the stove. When a child came in hungry from playing in the dirt yard, she dropped a handful into hot manteca. They puffed in seconds. She salted them and slid them into a paper sack. That was supper if supper had run out. Vendors during the Depression made enough on chicharrones to keep their own families fed, and children grew up remembering the smell of hot lard and red chili in the late afternoon. The most famous vendor in Boyle Heights was a man named Don Felipe Ortega, who pushed a wooden cart from 1931 until 1958, selling chicharrones for 1 cent each. The children learned to count by counting the wheels in his paper bag. Number 17. Calabacitas. Mexican zucchini cooked with corn, tomato, and a little onion. The cheapest summer vegetable in any colonia garden, because squash grew wild on whatever scrap of dirt a family could call their own. Your abuela diced the calabacitas, tossed them in the skillet with kernels cut fresh off the cob, a chopped tomato, and a handful of chopped cilantro. 5 minutes on a low flame and the squash turned tender, the corn went sweet, the tomato collapsed into a thin sauce. She served it on top of beans with a stack of tortillas on the side. Most families in the 1930s grew their own squash in a strip of yard between the house and the alley. The whole dish cost almost nothing, and it tasted like the garden itself. The squash variety most families planted was the Calabaza italiana, brought north from Mexico City. Seeds were saved every year in a paper envelope behind the stove, and the same seeds were planted in 1929, 1930, 1931, all the way through the war. Number 16. Atole de masa. Corn gruel, hot, served in a clay mug. Abuela toasted a quarter cup of masa harina in a dry skillet, whisked it into water with a stick of canela and a small piece of piloncillo. She let it thicken on a low flame for 15 minutes, stirring with a wooden spoon, and ladled it into mugs for the children before school on cold mornings. It cost about 2 cents a serving in 1933. The masa came from the same bag that made tortillas. The cinnamon stick lasted 6 months. The piloncillo, a cone of unrefined cane sugar, sat on a shelf for a year. Atole filled a small stomach and kept it warm for hours. In the colonias of Detroit and Chicago, where Mexican families had moved for factory work in the 1920s, atole was the breakfast that reminded them they were still home. The piloncillo cone came wrapped in a corn husk and cost 3 cents at the Mexican grocery on West 26th Street in Pilsen. One cone made atole for a family of 7 for an entire winter. Number 15. Tortas de huevo en caldillo. Egg patties in a thin tomato broth. This was what your abuela made when she had 2 eggs and 7 mouths. She beat the eggs hard, dropped them by the spoonful into hot manteca, where they puffed into little golden cakes, then dropped those cakes into a thin red broth made from 1 tomato, an onion, a clove of garlic, and a quart of water. The patties soaked up the broth and tripled in size on the plate. You ladled it over a torn tortilla and ate it with a spoon. 2 eggs fed 5 children. The whole meal cost 6 cents to put together in 1933. Now, here is the thing the cookbook writers never wrote down. The patties had to be golden on the outside before they hit the broth. If they went in raw, they fell apart and the soup turned into watery scramble. Abuela knew the timing without a clock. She fried them in batches of 3, slid them in, and the broth thickened on its own from the egg, coming out of the patties slow. By 1934, this dish had spread through every Mexican-American kitchen between San Antonio and Sacramento. It was the meal that fed children who would otherwise have gone to bed hungry, and the women who made it never once called it poor food. They called it supper. The caldillo broth, that thin red sauce, became the foundation of a dozen other dishes in the Mexican-American kitchen. You could drop in chunks of stale tortilla and call it sopa de tortilla. You could drop in fried cubes of potato and call it caldillo de papa. You could drop in slivers of beef from the soup bones and stretch a single shank into Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday supper. The grandmothers who fed 8 children on 6 cents understood something the modern kitchen has unlearned. A pot of red broth on the back burner was not a recipe. It was an entire week of meals waiting for whatever the day delivered. Number 14. Frijoles, refritos, and manteca. Refried beans cooked down in pork lard. Your abuela spooned cold beans from yesterday's pot into a hot iron skillet with 2 tablespoons of manteca. Mashed them with a wooden bean masher and cooked them down until the edges crisped and the middle went creamy. The whole skillet fed 8 people in 1933. She used a quarter pound of lard, which cost about 5 cents, and the beans were free, left over from the day before. You ate them spread on a tortilla with nothing else, and they were so rich you forgot there was no meat on the table. Mexican households during the Depression went through 5 pounds of pinto beans a week, bought in burlap sacks at the H.E. Butt grocery on Soledad Street for 18 cents. The lard at the bottom of the skillet got scraped into a tin can on the stove for tomorrow's tortillas. Nothing was wasted. The bean masher was a stick of oak carved by a husband or a brother, passed down for 2 generations. Doña Petra in Brownsville was still using her mother's masher in 1968. Number 13. Caldo de hueso. Bone broth from the bones the butcher could not sell. Doña Maria in Boyle Heights walked to the carniceria on Brooklyn Avenue every Saturday at 6 in the morning, before the regular customers came and asked the butcher for the marrow bones and the necks. He gave them to her for 5 cents a pound. She walked home with 3 pounds of bones in her apron and put them in a stock pot with water, half an onion, a carrot, and a sprig of cilantro. The pot simmered on the back burner all day Sunday. Monday morning, she had a gallon of broth that made soup for the whole week. The marrow she scraped onto warm tortillas for the children. Her husband took the bones with the meat scraps still clinging to them in his lunch pail to the rail yard at Union Station. He called it a feast because his children had eaten the soup the night before. Number 12. Sopa de bolita. Masa dumplings dropped into a thin tomato broth. Your abuela pinched off pieces of corn dough the size of a marble, rolled them between her palms, and dropped them into a pot of simmering broth made from 2 tomatoes, an onion, a sprig of epizot, and water. The bolitas sank, then floated. You knew they were done when they bobbed at the surface. The broth turned cloudy and starchy, and the dumplings tasted like the cleanest version of corn you ever ate. A pound of masa made 40 bolitas, enough to feed a family of 7 with leftovers for the next day. The whole soup cost about 9 cents in 1933, and it kept children warm on the cold nights when the wood stove was the only heat in the house. The epazote came from a plant Abuela kept on the back porch in a tin can. The same plant lived for 15 years, reseeding itself every spring, and the leaves she pinched off it in 1933 came from a line that started in a clay pot her mother carried from Guanajuato in 1908. Number 11. Capirotada. Lent bread pudding made from stale bolillos, piloncillo syrup, raisins, peanuts, and a little cheese on top. This was the dessert that got Mexican Catholic families through the 40 days of Lent during the Depression. Your abuela toasted the stale bread, layered it in a clay dish with chunks of piloncillo dissolved in cinnamon water, scattered raisins and peanuts and slices of queso fresco between the layers, and baked it in a wood-fired oven until the syrup thickened and the cheese melted into the bread. The whole pan cost about 12 cents in 1933 and fed a family of 8. The thing is, nothing in it was fresh. The bread was stale, the cheese was a week old, the piloncillo had been on the shelf since Christmas. But on Good Friday, when meat was forbidden and money was already gone, this pan came out of the oven smelling like cinnamon and warm sugar. The women called the children in from the yard to eat. Capirotada had a meaning the priest at Sacred Heart on East Houston Street explained every Lent. The bread was the body of Christ. The syrup was his blood. The cinnamon sticks were the wood of the cross, the cloves the nails, the melted cheese the shroud. For Mexican families who had lost everything, capirotada was the one Lent dessert that fed both the stomach and the soul. The children in 1934 did not understand the symbolism. They just knew this was the only sweet thing in the house for 40 days. Number 10. Migas con huevo. Stale tortillas torn into pieces and fried with eggs. The Spanish word migas means crumbs, and that was exactly what your abuela threw into the skillet every Saturday morning. She tore yesterday's leftover tortillas into rough squares, fried them in bacon grease until they crisped at the edges, then beat in 2 eggs and a chopped tomato. The eggs caught the crisp tortillas and turned them golden. She rolled the whole thing into a fresh tortilla and handed it to a child who ate it, walking out the back door. Migas cost almost nothing because the tortillas were already there. The eggs were 2 for a penny, and the bacon grease was free, scraped from breakfast the morning before. Mexican-American families across El Paso and San Antonio ate migas every Saturday for 40 years, from 1925 through the war. The stale tortillas, which any other family would have thrown out, became the best breakfast of the week. Doña Esperanza on Peco Street in El Paso made migas every Saturday from 1933 until she died in 1989. Her son Roberto ate them at the same table for 56 years. Number 9. Nopalitos guisados. Cactus paddles cooked with onion, tomato, and chile. Your abuela had a prickly pear growing in the yard. She cut a paddle in the morning with a knife wrapped in a rag, scraped off the spines on the porch step, and diced the green flesh into squares the size of a postage stamp. She boiled them for 10 minutes to draw out the slime, drained them, then sautéed them with onion and a chopped tomato until the kitchen smelled like a garden after rain. You ate nopalitos with eggs in the morning, with beans at noon, with tortillas at night. They were free. They grew on a plant nobody planted. The Aztecs had eaten them for 9,000 years, and a Mexican mother in 1934 fed her family from the same cactus her great-grandmother had cut. The original cactus in the yard of Doña Refugio in Tucson was planted by her grandmother in 1879 from a paddle brought up from Hermosillo. And here's the part that surprises people most. The plant is still there, owned by a great-grandson, and the family still eats from it. Number 8. Arroz con leche. Rice cooked slow in milk with a stick of canela and a strip of orange peel. The dessert every Mexican-American grandmother made on Sunday afternoons during the Depression. Your abuela simmered a cup of rice in a quart of whole milk for 40 minutes, stirring with a wooden spoon, adding a pinch of salt and a spoonful of sugar at the end. The rice swelled into a creamy pudding. She poured it into clay mugs and dusted the tops with cinnamon. 5 mugs from 1 quart of milk. The milk cost about 10 cents in 1932, the rice was 4 cents, and the cinnamon stick had been on the shelf since the year before. The children ate it warm with a spoon and asked for seconds. There were never seconds. But the kitchen smelled like the holiday it could not afford to celebrate. The rice most families bought during the Depression was Carolina long grain, sold in cloth sacks at La Tapatia Grocery on Olvera Street in Los Angeles. Doña Concepcion saved every cloth sack from 1929 through 1939 and stitched them into a quilt for her granddaughter's wedding bed in 1942. Number 7. Tortillas. Stale bolillo rolls soaked in milk and egg, fried in lard, drizzled with piloncillo syrup. The Mexican answer to French toast, made with the bread that had gone hard on the counter. Your abuela sliced the day-old bolillos into thick rounds, dipped them in beaten egg, whisked with milk and a touch of sugar, and fried them in a skillet of hot manteca until they crisped on both sides. Then she boiled water with a piloncillo cone, a clove, and a stick of cinnamon to make a thin brown syrup, and she poured it over the tortillas on a tin plate. 5 rolls fed 7 children. The whole dessert cost about 7 cents to make in 1933. Working-class Mexican families in the colonias of Tucson and Phoenix served tortillas during Lent and on Sundays when they wanted to feel like the week meant something. The bolillos came from La Reina Bakery on Stone Avenue in Tucson. The baker, Don Anselmo, sold day-old bread for half price every Saturday at noon. A bag of 6 rolls cost a nickel. Number 6. Albondigas en caldo. Small meatballs in a thin tomato broth. The trick was using a 1/4 pound of ground beef, a cup of cooked rice, an egg, a slice of stale bread soaked in milk, and a chopped onion. Your abuela mixed it all together and rolled 15 meatballs the size of walnuts. She dropped them into a pot of tomato broth with carrots, potatoes, and a sprig of mint. 20 cents of meat became dinner for a family of 7. The rice and bread filler doubled the size of each meatball, and the broth carried the flavor of the meat into every bite. Mothers in San Antonio in 1933 made albondigas every Tuesday. The thing they understood that nobody else did was that meat in the meatball was less important than meat in the broth. The bones from the butcher gave the broth its body. The little balls of beef were just the gift in the middle. The mint came from a pot on the windowsill. The same yerba buena cuttings had been passed sister to sister since the families left Mexico in 1916. Number 5. Tamales de frijol. Bean tamales. The Christmas tradition that survived the Depression. Because the families who could not afford pork made tamales filled with refried beans instead. Your abuela soaked corn husks for hours, beat fresh masa with manteca and salt until it floated when she dropped a piece in cold water, spread the masa on the husk with the back of a spoon, spooned a stripe of frijoles refritos down the center, folded the husk, tied it with a strip of corn shuck, and stacked them upright in a steamer pot. 40 tamales steamed for an hour and a half. Pork would have cost $1.50 for 40 tamales in 1932. The beans cost about 8 cents. The whole family helped on December 22nd, the children spreading the masa, the grandmothers tying the husks, the men carrying the steaming pots. On Christmas Eve, the smell of bean tamales filled every Mexican-American block from Chicago to Brownsville. The next day, the leftover tamales got fried in a skillet and split open with a fried egg on top. Nothing was thrown away. The tradition of family hands working together through the night kept what the Depression tried to take from them, which was the feeling of being a people together at a table. Number 4. Sopa seca de fideo. Dry noodle soup. The opposite of the brothy fideo on this list. Here, your abuela toasted the vermicelli in manteca until it went deep brown, poured in just enough tomato broth to barely cover the noodles, then covered the pot and let the noodles drink every drop of liquid. By the time she lifted the lid, the fideo had turned into a soft, savory, almost fluffy pasta that you ate with a fork. She crumbled queso fresco on top and a little chopped cilantro. The whole pan fed 8 in 1933. Mexican mothers in California's Central Valley made sopa seca on Wednesdays and Saturdays during the worst years of the Depression. The noodles came in a 5-cent package, and one package fed the whole family. The trick was knowing when to lift the lid. Too soon, and the noodles were watery. Too late, and they stuck to the bottom of the pan. Your abuela knew by smell. The detail few people remember about sopa seca is that the queso fresco on top was made at home. Doña Cleotilde in Fresno kept a goat in the yard and made fresh cheese every Sunday morning by curdling the milk with a few drops of lime juice and pressing it through cheesecloth. A handful of that cheese went on the sopa seca an hour later. Number 3. Mole pobre. Poor man's mole. The simplified version of the sauce that took 30 ingredients in wealthy kitchens, made with whatever the household could afford. Your abuela toasted 3 dried chiles, a piece of stale bread, a tablespoon of peanuts, a square of Mexican chocolate, a clove of garlic, and a few sesame seeds. She ground it all on the metate by hand for an hour, thinned it with chicken broth from the bones, and spooned it over a single chicken thigh shared between 4 people. The poor man's mole used a third of the ingredients of a wedding mole. It cost about 30 cents in 1933 to make. But the depth of flavor in a single spoonful tasted exactly the way her own mother's mole had tasted in the village in Puebla, because the technique mattered more than the ingredients. The grinding on the metate, the slow toasting of the chiles, the patience to bring the sauce to one consistency. That was the real recipe. The chocolate was a half square of Ibarra, a brand sold in Mexico since 1925, broken in 2 and used over 2 Sundays. Number 2. Caldo de res con huesos. Beef bone soup made almost entirely from bones. Your abuela bought 3 pounds of beef shank with the marrow still in the bone for 25 cents, simmered them for 4 hours with cabbage, carrots, chayote squash, a half ear of corn cut into pieces, and a sprig of mint. The broth turned the color of weak coffee, the marrow melted out of the bones into the pot, and the vegetables soaked up the savor of the meat without needing the meat itself. She served the broth in a clay bowl with chopped cilantro and onion on top, a wedge of lime on the side, and a stack of warm tortillas. 5 bones fed 12 people. Mexican families in 1932 called this the Sunday soup because it was the meal that made them feel rich for 2 hours. The bones went back into the pot Monday morning for one more round of broth. Nothing in the kitchen was ever cooked once. Everything had a second life. Number 1. Tortillas con sal. A warm tortilla with a pinch of salt. The food that kept Mexican-American children alive when there was nothing else in the house. Your abuela pulled a tortilla off the comal, sprinkled it with coarse salt from a small clay bowl, rolled it tight, and pressed it into a child's hand. That was lunch. That was supper, if supper had not come. In the worst weeks of 1933, when the rent ate the food money and the children's shoes had holes worn through to the dirt, the tortilla with salt was what stood between a family and hunger. It was warm. It tasted like home. It cost less than a penny. And the woman who made it, who stood at the comal turning each one with her bare fingers, never once told her children they were poor. She told them to eat slow and chew well, because that was the dignity she kept. That was what the Depression could not take. A boy named Salvador Mendoza, born in El Paso in 1925, told his grandchildren in 1995 that the taste of a hot tortilla with salt still made him cry. He said it tasted like 1933. These dishes are gone now. Most of the grandchildren who grew up on them have stopped making them, and their own grandchildren have never tasted them. The tortillas come from a factory in plastic. The beans come from a can. The broth comes from a cube. But the women who fed 8 children on 20 cents a day did something the modern kitchen has forgotten how to do. They turned almost nothing into a meal that kept a family at the table together. Tell me in the comments which of these dishes your own abuela made. Tell me the one she never wrote down. Because these were not poor recipes. They were the proof that a comal and a pair of patient hands were enough.